The quiet Oakwood rest stop, nestled along a solitary stretch of highway, was about to witness an unexpected turn of events. Ryan Daniels, a seasoned former Army officer, pulled over for a much-needed break. He had been driving for hours, seeking some relief from the monotony of the road. Little did he know, he was about to confront a situation far different from the challenges he'd faced in his military career. He wasn't looking for any kind of drama today, just a peaceful moment to catch his breath before getting back on the road. Ryan, now in his mid-40s, had spent much of his life on high-alert missions, where every instinct had to be razor-sharp. As an officer, he had learned to trust his senses in high-stakes situations where one wrong move could mean the difference between life and death. However, today was different. Today, he was no longer in combat, no longer living in the adrenaline-fueled chaos that defined much of his younger years. He was just a man seeking respite from the world, hoping for a cup of coffee and a few minutes of quiet. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the highway, and Ryan decided this rest stop was as good a place as any to recharge. The road ahead stretched endlessly, a ribbon of asphalt cutting through the open land, surrounded by trees and the occasional clump of brush. The rest stop itself was a small, almost forgotten area, with a handful of vehicles scattered around the lot. Nothing particularly noteworthy, just another roadside pit stop along the long stretch of Highway 52, a place that seemed to be nothing more than a break in the monotony of the open road. As Ryan stepped out of his car, he inhaled deeply, taking in the crisp air. The cool breeze carried with it the scent of the countryside, a mixture of pine, dust, and the distant smell of earth. The fading light bathed the world in a peaceful golden glow, and for a moment, Ryan could almost forget the urgency that had once been his constant companion. This tranquility stood in stark contrast to the memories of tense moments he'd encountered in combat, but today there was calm. He hoped for nothing more than a cup of coffee and a few minutes of quiet. For once, he longed for a peaceful break. No chaos, no pressure, just a brief moment to himself. Walking into the diner, Ryan was greeted by its warm atmosphere. The room was cozy and simple, with mismatched tables, plastic chairs, and some faded landscape paintings on the walls. The soft sound of old country music played from a radio perched on the counter, blending with the quiet clink of dishes being washed and utensils being scraped. In one corner, an elderly couple sat, exchanging soft murmurs about the weather or their plans for the day. A few truck drivers sat at a long booth, sipping their coffee and engaging in light banter about the road. The mundane conversations and the sleepy hum of the diner made it easy to forget the busy, dangerous life Ryan had left behind. Everything felt ordinary, mundane, like another day in a sleepy, small-town diner. It was a far cry from the intensity of the situations Ryan had once dealt with in his career. This was the calm he had been yearning for. But just as he moved toward the counter to place his order, something caught his eye in the corner of the room. His military-trained senses immediately went on alert. There, near the window, sat an older white man. Probably in his early 50s, the man wore a crisp, navy suit that contrasted sharply with the relaxed, unassuming vibe of the diner. His salt and pepper hair was neatly combed, his posture calm and collected as he read a newspaper, though Ryan quickly realized he wasn't actually reading it. The man's eyes barely moved over the pages, his focus directed elsewhere, yet his body language told a different story. Ryan could tell he wasn't just an ordinary diner patron killing time on a break. Across from the man sat a young black girl, probably around 8 years old. She was dressed in a bright yellow dress that stood out against the otherwise muted colors of the diner. Her clothing, pristine yet slightly disheveled, seemed out of place in this otherwise casual setting. The girl sat quietly, her small hands nervously clutching the hem of her dress, as if trying to find some comfort in the fabric. Her eyes, wide and filled with worry, shifted constantly, scanning the room, never resting on any one place for long. She was small, delicate, and looked far younger than her years. There was something in her posture that spoke of unease, something that sent a shiver down Ryan's spine. Ryan's instincts, honed by years of service, immediately triggered a sense of unease. Something was off. The strange contrast between the two, an older man in a sharp suit and a young girl in a bright yellow dress set off alarms in his mind. The disparity in their ages, their races, and the palpable tension between them created a situation that felt far from ordinary. At first glance, it could have been a father and daughter having a quiet meal, but something in the way the girl kept fidgeting in her seat and the way the man kept glancing at her made Ryan suspicious. The man's gaze wasn't one of care or concern, as a father might look at his child. No, there was something darker in it. The intensity with which the man watched her every move, the subtle control he seemed to exert over her, despite the calm outward appearance, struck Ryan as more than just an innocent father-daughter moment. Ryan's attention narrowed on the girl. She fidgeted uncomfortably in her seat, her gaze darting nervously around the room. She seemed to be waiting for something, perhaps a sign, perhaps a way out. Her small hands trembled slightly as she twisted her dress tighter and tighter, the fabric becoming wrinkled with each anxious pull. Her eyes never stopped moving, and Ryan could see the fear in them, a fear that sent a chill through him. Is everything okay here? Ryan thought to himself as the unease grew. Could the man be the girl's father, or perhaps an adoptive relative? It was possible, but Ryan's instincts told him that something darker could be lurking beneath the surface. There was a tension in the air that couldn't be ignored. The man's demeanor, though calm and collected, was a facade. Ryan could sense that something was being concealed. He ordered his coffee and tried to keep a low profile, remaining at the counter but watching the interaction unfold from a safe distance. He had learned, in his years of service, that ordinary situations could sometimes conceal hidden dangers. And right now, all his senses were on high alert. The girl's behavior, the strange dynamic between the man and her, and the man's occasional, deliberate glances were setting off red flags that Ryan couldn't ignore. As he sipped his coffee, he tried to stay inconspicuous, blending in with the other patrons. He knew better than to act impulsively, especially when it wasn't clear what exactly was happening. He wasn't sure if he was witnessing a father's strict discipline or something far more sinister. However, the more he watched, the more his suspicions grew. There was no obvious explanation for the way the girl seemed to shrink into her seat, for the way her body language screamed anxiety. Ryan continued to observe carefully. He knew how to read people, how to assess situations based on the smallest of details. And everything about this scene, every movement, every glance was telling him that something was wrong. But what could he do? What if he was just overthinking it, seeing danger where there was none? Yet, as the girl's trembling hands continued to clutch the hem of her dress, and the man continued to watch her with unsettling intensity, Ryan's instincts told him that he couldn't walk away. The unease inside him only grew stronger, but he remained where he was, observing, waiting. Ryan knew better than to rush in without understanding the full scope of the situation. His years of military service had taught him to be patient, to listen to his gut, and to trust the subtle clues people gave away. Right now, every fiber of his being was telling him that something was amiss. Ryan stood by the counter, his coffee in hand, but his attention never wavered from the man and the girl. His instincts were sharpening by the second, focusing on every detail, every subtle movement. The girl, her legs swinging beneath the table, still didn't reach the floor, and her fidgeting only seemed to grow more pronounced as the silence between them stretched on. She looked at her hands, twisting the hem of her dress, trying to calm herself, but Ryan noticed her eyes would often flick back to the man, only to quickly avert when his gaze fell upon her. The older man, though outwardly calm, seemed to be watching the girl in a way that was too controlled. He might have been appearing relaxed, flipping through his newspaper and sipping coffee as though it were a normal, casual moment. But Ryan noticed the slight tension in his posture, the way his eyes never strayed far from the girl. He would glance up at her the moment she moved or adjusted herself, a subtle, yet unmistakable vigilance. The kind of watchfulness that suggested control, not care. Ryan's heart rate quickened as the realization hit him. This wasn't just a quiet family stop. This wasn't a simple road trip with a tired child. There was something deeper at play. The girl's fear, though subtle, was palpable, and it made Ryan's blood run cold. Every time she dared to make eye contact with anyone, it was as if she was silently begging for help, her dark eyes wide with an unspoken plea. Ryan leaned against the counter, pretending to browse the diner menu, trying to maintain the facade of a regular customer. He had learned from years in combat that rushing into a situation without understanding the full picture could be disastrous. But this felt different. The girl's eyes locked with his for a split second, and for that brief moment, Ryan saw something that confirmed all his fears. She wasn't just anxious or uncomfortable. She was scared. She was terrified. And that terror spoke volumes to Ryan, who had faced situations that required quick action without hesitation. He sipped his coffee, trying to focus on the task at hand, figuring out the next move. Should he approach them directly, or wait until he was sure? His hand tightened around the cup, but he stayed in place, calculating his options carefully. If he made a wrong move, it could backfire. If the man realized something was wrong, he might take the girl and leave before the authorities could arrive. Ryan's mind raced, his heart pounding in his chest. He couldn't let that happen. His instincts had never failed him before, and they were screaming at him now. Do something. Do it now. But how could he act without risking the girl's safety? Every second that passed made the situation more volatile. The girl shifted again, and Ryan's sharp eyes caught a tiny but significant detail. She raised her hand to brush her hair away from her face, but as she did, her fingers spread open in a subtle, deliberate gesture, palm facing outward. It was small, almost imperceptible to anyone who wasn't paying close attention, but to Ryan, it was a distress signal, one he recognized all too well from his military training. It wasn't just an accidental motion. It was an act of silent communication, a way of signaling distress without attracting attention. Ryan's pulse quickened. This was no longer just a suspicion. It was a cry for help. The girl, without saying a word, was telling him she needed help, and Ryan couldn't ignore it. His training kicked in, and without hesitation, he pulled his phone from his pocket and dialed 911. His fingers shook as he spoke, but his voice was steady. "Hello, I need to report an emergency. I'm at the Oakwood rest stop. There's a young girl here, around 8, and she's with a middle-aged man. I believe she's signaling for help. I think it's a kidnapping." Ryan provided the dispatcher with the details, including the description of the man and the girl. He emphasized that the girl was showing signs of distress and that something was very wrong. The operator promised that help was on the way, but Ryan knew that the next few minutes would feel like an eternity. "Stay calm," the operator said. "The police are en route." Ryan's eyes never left the table where the man and girl sat. His heart pounded as the seconds ticked by, but he knew he had done the right thing. All he could do now was wait and make sure that the situation didn't escalate. As Ryan stood there by the counter, he kept his focus trained on the girl and the man. He watched as the man kept his gaze fixed on her, his expression never changing, like a predator eyeing its prey. The girl's body remained stiff, but Ryan noticed her hands trembling, her small fingers twisting the hem of her dress tighter with each passing moment. Her eyes, once darting around the room nervously, now settled downward, trying to avoid making eye contact with anyone, especially the man. Ryan's heart sank as he realized just how much control the man had over her. He was doing everything he could to keep her subdued, and his awareness of the situation was chilling. If the man knew the authorities were on the way, he might do something drastic. Ryan's muscles tensed as he prepared himself for whatever might come next. Suddenly, the door opened with a soft jingle, and 2 officers stepped inside. Ryan's pulse surged with a mixture of relief and anxiety. They were here. But as they walked in, the atmosphere in the diner shifted. The man, still seated, glanced nervously toward the door. Ryan noticed the subtle shift in his demeanor. His posture stiffened, and his eyes flicked to the girl before quickly darting toward the police officers. The change in him was almost imperceptible, but to Ryan, it was clear the man knew something was up. The man stood abruptly, his jacket slipping off his shoulders as he began to tug at it. His face had drained of color, but he still kept a firm grip on the girl's hand, pulling her with him as if trying to rush out of the diner. Ryan's mind raced. This was the moment he had been waiting for. If the man tried to leave now, things would spiral out of control. He couldn't let the girl slip away. As he moved towards them, trying to make his approach as casual as possible, Ryan kept his eyes locked on the man and the girl. He needed to make sure nothing escalated until the police could fully take control. He was only a few steps away when the man froze, and a forced smile spread across his face. "Oh, we're just about to head out," the man said in an overly calm voice, but Ryan could see the cracks in his cool exterior. He wasn't fooling anyone, least of all Ryan. Ryan stepped closer, now directly in front of him. "Everything okay here?" he asked in a low, steady voice, his gaze shifting between the girl and the man. The man stiffened, his expression shifting from polite to tense. He gave a strained chuckle, attempting to brush past the question. Yes. Just tired, you know? Long trip. She's my niece." Ryan didn't buy it. The story didn't add up. He crouched down a little to look the girl in the eyes. She refused to meet his gaze, glancing at the man nervously before quickly turning her eyes downward. "Are you okay?" Ryan asked her gently, his voice filled with more concern than he could hide. The girl didn't respond immediately. She glanced quickly at the man, then back at Ryan. Her lips quivered, but no sound came out. She gave a small, stiff nod. The gesture, forced and unnatural, sent a chill down Ryan's spine. Something was very wrong here. Before he could act further, the man, still attempting to maintain his composure, began moving toward the door, pulling the girl with him. Ryan's gut screamed at him to act, but he held back just long enough to make sure the situation didn't explode. At that moment, the two officers who had entered earlier moved in closer, their presence undeniable. One of the officers, a tall man with a sharp gaze, spoke first, his voice loud and firm. "Excuse me, sir. We have a few questions for you." The man's face blanched. He hesitated, his hand still gripping the girl's arm. "We've received a report about a suspicious situation involving this girl," the officer continued, moving closer. "We need to confirm your relationship with her." The man quickly straightened his posture, trying to retain some semblance of control. "She's my niece," he said again, his voice strained, but Ryan could hear the uncertainty beneath it. The officer, undeterred, turned to the girl. "Your niece, huh? Young lady, can you tell me who this man is?" The girl's eyes shifted nervously between the officer and the man. She trembled slightly, her hands shaking as she clutched them together tightly. She seemed to be gathering her strength, her whole body trembling from the weight of what she was about to say. Finally, she opened her mouth, her voice barely audible. I need help," she whispered. The words were soft, but to Ryan, they were deafening. Every muscle in his body relaxed as the truth came rushing to the surface. The girl had spoken. She was no longer hiding in silence. The man's expression shifted immediately. Panic flashed across his face. His hand tightened around the girl's arm as if trying to drag her away before the officers could respond. But the officers were prepared. One stepped forward, his voice sharp and authoritative. "Let go of the girl," he commanded. "Now." The man hesitated for a moment, a brief flicker of defiance in his eyes. But the officer's presence was too much. Reluctantly, he released the girl's hand, stepping back with visible unease. Ryan's chest tightened with a mix of relief and anger. The police were moving in swiftly now. One officer was already speaking to the girl, offering her comfort, while the other officer moved to restrain the man. Handcuffs clicked around his wrists as the reality of the situation began to settle in. Ryan watched as the girl was carefully escorted away from the man, her shoulders trembling but no longer filled with that crushing fear. A quiet sense of peace seemed to radiate from her now, and Ryan knew that she was finally safe. The officers finished their work, quickly taking the man into custody. As he was led out of the diner, still protesting his innocence, Ryan couldn't help but feel a deep sense of satisfaction. He had trusted his instincts, and because of that, a young girl was safe. As the scene began to settle, the officer who had been closest to Ryan walked over, his expression filled with gratitude. "Thank you, sir," the officer said. "You did the right thing. If you hadn't intervened, who knows what might have happened?" Ryan simply nodded, feeling the weight of the situation ease from his shoulders. He hadn't done it for recognition. He had acted because he knew what was at stake. Just then, another vehicle pulled up outside. The girl's biological father, a middle-aged man with a face full of anxiety, rushed inside. His eyes scanned the room frantically until they landed on his daughter. The relief in his expression was palpable. "Emma," he called out, his voice thick with emotion. The girl's face lit up as she turned to her father. Without hesitation, she ran toward him, throwing herself into his arms. Tears flowed freely from both their eyes as they embraced, the weight of their separation finally lifting. Ryan stood back, his heart swelling with emotion. He had been part of something important today. A small but vital act of courage had brought a family back together. As the girl and her father shared their reunion, Ryan knew that his decision to act had changed everything. The small choices people made in the face of adversity could have huge, life-altering consequences. Later, as the police continued their work and the family began to heal, one of the officers approached Ryan once more, thanking him again for his courage and for trusting his instincts. "I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't been there," the officer said. "You saved a life today." Ryan nodded, acknowledging the thanks, but inside he felt a quiet sense of pride. Sometimes, courage wasn't about grand gestures. Sometimes it was simply about doing the right thing, no matter how small it seemed. As he left the diner, Ryan glanced one last time at the reunited family. Their lives were forever changed, and in that moment, he knew that the quiet courage to intervene when needed could make a world of difference.